Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Amanda Leduc. I am one of two writers in residence this year at McMaster University, alongside Katerina Babkina, who is the e-writer in residence. Myself and Katerina are two writers and individuals who are working with the university this year as a resource. So if you are a writer yourself, or perhaps you're emerging, or writing is something that you've always wanted to do, please do feel free to visit the Department of English page on the McMaster website and look up the writer in residence and see what things we have on offer, how we can help you. I have office hours on Mondays and Fridays, and I would be more than happy to meet with anybody in the community. However, today I am not here in that capacity. I am here to welcome you all to this wonderful event. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Telling Other People's Tales, the Art and Craft of Ghostwriting with John Lawrence Reynolds. If you have a question after John's presentation, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to put your Q&A in there, and John and I will get to the questions after his presentation. This event is made possible through McMaster Alumni Engagement and the Faculty of Humanities Careers Office, which is represented by Christina Foley, who is here with me today to also help welcome you to this event. So Christina, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Good afternoon. My name is Christina Foley. I'm the Manager of Career and Experiential Programs here in the Faculty of Humanities Student Experience Office. Our team supports undergraduate humanities students by designing and facilitating opportunities to engage in career development and experiential learning. We manage the Humanities Career Apprenticeship Program, which provides final year students with 12-month paid employment opportunities after graduation. We also run the Humanities Internship Program, which offers paid for credit, full or part-time work placements for students in level 2 and above. To support career planning and decision-making, we are responsible for the Humanities 2 CP2 course, which is McMaster's first for-credit career planning course. And we also offer one-to-one career support meetings for resume or cover letter review, general career advice, interview preparation, or LinkedIn profile review for students. If you have an interest in learning more about these opportunities, I will add our website in the chat. But for now, I'm very pleased to introduce John Reynolds. John is a Mac grad from the class of 1974 and has been called one of Canada's best ghostwriters, having written for Justin Trudeau and Robert Herjavec. His full bio is available in the chat. And John is here to share a presentation about his career, featuring a few tales and some takeaways for those with an interest in writing. Please join me in welcoming John.
Okay, I'm pleased to be here today to talk to people who are interested in ghostwriting, either because of the nature of the craft and perhaps even if they want to become a ghostwriter. I don't think any writer sets out to follow that particular professional path, so neither did I, as a matter of fact, but I always wanted to be a writer. And as like all writers, I hope someday to be going to have a book published. There's something very special about having a book in your hands, which you assume is going to be on shelves all over town, if not all over the country. And at some point, someone in the future will choose to read it. So I'd like to run through a bit of a presentation I have here, which essentially established my bona fides as a writer and how I went into this particular craft. And I've even got 7 suggestions on those who may choose to explore ghostwriting, some paths they should follow. So let's see if we can take a look at it now. There we are. So as I mentioned, I really had never planned to be a ghostwriter. I don't think anyone was or has. I wanted to write. I would like to have been a journalist, but instead I fell into advertising, where I could also do writing, copywriting, of course, advertising copywriting. This proved to be pretty successful, which meant, like most creative people in advertising, by the age of 35 or so, I wanted to get out of it. So I moved into freelance writing, did a lot of feature writing and other assignments. And after about 10 years, actually had my first novel published, which was a a mystery novel because that's what I like to read. And I did a series of a Boston detective named Joe McGuire. Did 6 of these and 3 or 4 others on different topics, and they did fairly well in terms of the reviews they received, but they were not all that successful at generating the kind of income I wanted or needed. So for that, I moved into nonfiction writing. That's another mystery. I did a local one, by the way, called Beach Strip. And nonfiction writing began with a true crime book called Free Rider, which won not only an Arthur Ellis Award, but also a National Business Book Award. This gave me an insight into financial investment, which I'd already picked up in my advertising career. So this led to a book called The Naked Investor and a series of others, all dealing with the problems and the opportunities with financial investing, which people need to know, especially if they're saving for an RRSP. This suddenly opened up all sorts of vistas for me in terms of nonfiction writing. At one point about, oh goodness, what, 15 years ago now, I guess I was having a conversation with publisher Anna Porter, who was decrying the fact that Dan Brown's book, The Da Vinci Code, which most people in publishing thought was not the most admirable book they had seen, was selling over 40 million copies and was being made into a major movie with Tom Hanks. And either Anna or I said, you know, somebody should write a real book about secret societies and what they really mean and make it entertaining. And Anna said, you write the book and I'll sell it around the world. Well, in a number of countries anyway. So I did, and we sold it in 15 countries and 12 languages, and it did very well. Now you say, okay, what's holding all these things together? You're writing mystery novels, you're writing exposures or insights on secret societies and financials and so on. And what holds it together, of course, is it's all about storytelling. And all societies, especially those in pre-literate days, value storytellers. They're the ones who knew and kept and shared the myths and the values and so on. And I think if you enjoy storytelling, you're not interested in textbooks necessarily, you want to tell stories, either yours or someone else's, well, maybe you could find a career in ghostwriting. Storytelling, I think, depends on what I call the 4 most magic words in English, which is once upon a time. And ghostwriting depends on that quite a bit. So here are my comments, my suggestions on ghostwriting, if you want to follow up on it after we get into some of the insights I can offer on it. One of my most recent published ghostwritten books is about Michael Wilson, an interesting guy who was Brian Mulroney's finance minister and really one of the most admirable guys in government at the time. This is called Something Within Me. Interestingly enough, the book I just completed a few weeks ago is about a liberal finance minister who resigned a couple of years ago. He's, you may say to yourself, well, you know, you're bouncing back and forth between, or Reynolds is bouncing back and forth between conservatives and liberals. Has he done anything else on the political side? Well, as a matter of fact, I wrote the book with Wab Kinew, a really interesting fellow who had quite a career on CBC and is now the leader of the NDP in Manitoba. So how do I make these decisions and who I'm going to work closely with? Because let's be clear, if you're going to ghostwrite a book with someone and get into his or her inner thoughts, as you should to a certain degree, of course, you essentially become their best friend for 6 months or so until the book is written. You have to get along with these folks or both you and the book will suffer. My point of view is let's put principle among politics. And all the people I've worked with in politics, and I've been a number, I like them as people and I admire their principles. Their actual policies became secondary to those concerns. This is one of perhaps the ultimate political book in the last few years, and this has quite a story behind it, which again should illustrate some of the aspects of being a ghostwriter. HarperCollins back in 2014 knew what Justin Trudeau's political ambitions were, as did the rest of the country, of course, and they contracted a writer to write Justin's book for him. This was someone who was editor of a prestigious magazine, but had never done ghostwriting before, and frankly did everything wrong. He submitted 3 or 4 versions of the book, none of which were acceptable. HarperCollins wanted the book published in time to coincide with Justin's leadership success, which everyone saw, saw coming. And they had about 8 weeks to take the rough work from the hired ghostwriter, put me in position to get it done. And by the way, I would not have direct access to Justin Trudeau. I would work through Jerry Butts, his right-hand person, and some of his staff members. So my agent and I set down the 3 conditions to do this. One was a fat fee, which my agent got. The second was some credit, which I got in the acknowledgements. I knew I wouldn't get it on the front cover. And the third was a better title than was being suggested at the time. The title being suggested by the original ghostwriter was Maple 3. And the source of this was that when Justin was living with his parents on Sussex Drive, his father, Pierre, was of course Maple 1 in terms of RCMP codes to identify who they were with. His mother, Margaret, was Maple 2 and Justin was Maple 3. Very cute, but frankly, a pretty lousy title for a book. So Common Ground came out and proved very successful for everyone, especially, of course, the current Prime Minister. I also moved into writing, ghostwriting for major industry figures. This is one, Rick George, who made Suncor such a huge success and was a fascinating individual. And whatever your points of view may be in the oil sands, if you read Rick's book, which I wrote with and for him, you would see that he is as sensitive as can be to the whole point of transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable energies, and invested quite a bit of Suncor's money and efforts into wind power and solar power and so on. My point again being that whoever you're going to work with, you have to understand all the facets of their belief and their beliefs and what they managed to achieve from them. Here's a guy who some people might recognize right away. Robert is both a businessman and a celebrity, and he leans very much on the second part of that equation. Yes, that's his private jet there in the background, and that's one of his 7 Ferraris. And did 3 books with him, and enjoyed the process on a number of measures. Driven was the first. This was followed up by The Will to Win. By this time, he was on Shark Tank, and the third came along after Robert suffered a personal tragedy in the end of his marriage, and came out of the depths of depression to do this one. Again, it's a matter of getting into, in this case, Robert's head, some of his values, some of his, obviously a good deal of his background, and an enormous amount of his business approach, which makes up the bulk of the text. I've dealt with some people of quite different measures as well. In this case, a fellow called Alex Kane, whose profession, if you want to call it that, was to find himself or bring himself into the lives and activities of motorcycle gangs and drug dealers all across North America. He had written a couple of books. He actually hadn't written them. He had other ghostwriters. This one he couldn't complete. So I was hired to do the book. And I never met the man. He dedicated the book to my wife and I, calling us the 2 nicest people he'd never met. He also managed to snooker me out of several $1,000s by forging the contract with the publisher. And I say with neither joy nor regret that he is no longer living, and I have nothing to do with his passing. Other ghostwriting projects come along from the strangest sources. This is Donald Shepard, a Canadian fellow who was a client of mine when I was freelancing, doing a lot of business writing. He moved to the US, became very successful, and I reconnected with him in 2016 over dinner. And he said at that time he was so disturbed over the prospect of Donald Trump being elected president of the US. And if that ever happened, Don Shepard would have me ghostwrite a book about the dangers of Donald Trump in the president's office, something that we both shared. 2 days after Trump's election, Don Shepard called me, and off we went to produce this book, The Dividends of Decency. So that's one of about, or a bunch of about 20 books I've ghostwritten over the years. And from that, I've formulated 7 rules for those who might consider this, as I said, as a possible pastime or means of earning funds. So here we go with the 7 rules. Number 1, check your ego. If you're a ghostwriter, the book is not about you, it's not for you, and your values, frankly, are of no real concern compared with the values of your subject. And this goes back to the idea, if you can't get along or match your values to the subjects, walk away from the deal. Number 2, hear the voice. And this is a critical part in ghostwriting to my point of view. I have a background in music, and music tells you, especially jazz music, to listen very carefully to everything else that's going on around you. And in every book I've ghostwritten, the style of the text, which of course is written in the first person, varies somewhat because it reflects what I've picked up as the speaking style of the subject. I managed to do this with digital computers. I record every discussion with the subject along with my notes. I transfer the digital recordings to my computer, and before any writing session to prepare the book for the subject, I listen for several minutes to him or her talking. In my case, it's primarily a male. And when I write the book, that's the voice I'm hearing in my head, and it comes through. If you read a book, one of the books I've ghostwritten by, say, Buzz Hargrove, it's very different from the style in the book that I wrote on behalf of and with Robert Milton and any of the politicians. The reader may not say, oh, that sounds like so-and-so, but they will recognize that it's familiar to them, at least in the context of what they're reading. So that's number 2. Listen to the voice. Hear that voice when you're writing the book. The voice is not yours. The voice is your subject's. Number 3, find the story arc. We all know that stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and we have to locate that arc, but that doesn't mean that's where you start the story. Okay, you know, you may hear the old adage about, yes, a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points, but it's also the most boring trip. If you're preparing the arc of a story of someone's biography, which you are the author of, you have to find some way to make it interesting from the very first pages. This means crafting the opening on something that is critical to the story arc itself. I could talk about that a little bit later in detail if you like. Another one is mind the experiences. Again, it's not your story, it's your subject story. And your subject has had experiences which to them may be minor in the context of what they're talking about, but to you as a storyteller can become very valuable. In Michael Wilson's book, for example, believe it or not, he went through a midnight surprise party for Mick Jagger. How did that come about? A wonderful story. And I expanded that, not simply to make it more interesting to the reader, which of course it did, but also to widen the understanding of what kind of person Michael Wilson was. I did a book with Brian Tobin, the former fisheries minister and the former premier of Newfoundland. He spoke about his family, his wide Newfoundland family. He spoke about his father and the position his father had as head of the family, and about the tragedy of his father's passing. And he mentioned, Brian did, that the family gathered when his father was dying of cancer and they knew the end was near. And I said, oh, whoa. And he went on to something else. I said, well, tell me more about that. Because this picture of a large Newfoundland family at such an event, I knew had some very strong story elements. And Brian said to me that someone, knowing that it was their father's last few moments, began to softly sing Tooraloo Allura, the Irish lullaby, and they all joined in. Sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters and cousins, and this whole picture of a group of Newfoundlanders standing around the bed on which the father was passing was simply just too powerful to ignore. These are the things as a ghostwriter you have to pull out of your subjects. They're not the storytellers, you are, but they have the stories and you have to find them. And this is an important point, I think. Number 5 is keep the faith. And that is, you have to keep the faith to the publisher and to the reader as well. On a couple of occasions, I've had subjects say, well, maybe we can put a story in about this or that. And I said, no, if it didn't happen, if it did not happen, you can't talk about it. And simply refuse to put in anything that's not true in the book, because I think you owe it to your readers and you owe it to the publisher, and frankly, you owe it to the subject. Now, I have, of course, committed the sin of omission when a subject has talked about something and I think, oh boy, that's not very good, and so let's just not put that in the book. I'll keep it in mind, but it won't be in the book. And number 6 is remember the reader. You're focusing on the subject, obviously, but once again, you're telling the story. You're not writing a textbook. And if you want the book to be a success, if you want the widest readership possible, you have to pull the reader into the story and maintain the idea, the effort to have the reader keep turning the pages. This is something I picked up from my advertising days. Over my typewriter, which you can tell was a very long time ago, I kept a small sign, and the sign said, nobody wants to read it. And this reminded me as a writer that everyone out there has their own lives to follow, their own crises to bear. And if you want them to read whatever you'd written, you darn well better work at it to make it so enticing, so intriguing, so rewarding that the reader enjoys reading. And finally, number 7, honor the deal. As a ghostwriter, you're a professional. You're not sitting in a garret somewhere writing the great Canadian novel, or hoping you are. You are a professional being paid, by the way, if I may say, generally substantially sized fees. You have something to owe the subject. You have a great deal to own the publisher, and you have much to own the readers. So that's where it stands. And by the way, we can never, the benefit of being a ghostwriter, from my point of view, is not just the fact that you spend a good deal of time generally with pretty entertaining and intriguing people. You become their best friends, if you will, for about 6 months, but you're doing it as a profession, as I mentioned earlier, and not to reward or your ego, or to establish your name as a writer, but as a means of making a living, which is something all writers want to do. So the reward is your name isn't always on the cover, but it's always on the check. And at that point, I'd like to discuss it and any aspect that you would like. And I'll go back to, I hope I can go back to everyone else over there at McMaster.
Well, that was wonderful, John, and such a great point to end on too. I know certainly for myself as a writer, it's always nice to have your name on the check. So that's a great thing. Just before we hop into the questions, we do have some questions in the Q&A, which I'll go through. And we did have some questions that were submitted in advance of the webinar too. People have lots of things that they'd like to know from you. And I just wanted to remind the audience that when the webinar ends, a little survey will pop up. And that will also be your opportunity to let us know how you like the presentation, and if you'd like to see more of this, what other kinds of programming you'd like the Alumni Office to support. So please do feel free to fill out that survey afterwards. And so the first question for you, John, is kind of a broad one, which is, why do you feel that we need ghostwriters? And what kinds of people are ghostwriters typically hired for? Are you usually writing for sort of media personalities? Is it media personalities / politicians? Is it wider than that? Can you talk a little bit about where all that comes from?
Yes, well, as per the second part of your question, I've always kept the opportunities as wide as possible, simply because I'm interested in people, and I honestly believe there's nothing more interesting or more fascinating than another human being. And as a ghostwriter, you get an opportunity to explore that, and as I say, tell their stories. As per your first question, let's be reasonable about this. If we're talking about primary subjects for ghostwriters, are politicians, senior business people, and celebrities. These are people who have very busy lives of their own. Mm-hmm. And to expect a politician at almost any level being able to set aside 2 or 3 hours a day and craft 500 to 1,000 words in that day and carry that on for whatever time it takes to wrap up 80 to 100,000 words, which is the number of words we're talking about here for the ghostwritten book, is ridiculous. And that's not just the time, it's also the skill to do it. Just because you got a B+ in an essay and you're grade 11 English, that doesn't automatically make you a writer, as every writer or wannabe writer knows. And just because you're a celebrity politician, that doesn't work either. There's a not famous, but a very old joke about the story of the brain surgeon who meets a writer at a party. And during the conversation, I see you've heard this one before. The brain surgeon says, I was thinking when I retire, I might try writing. To which the writer says, oh, what a coincidence. I was thinking when I retire, I might try brain surgery. Come on. If we're talking about a book of some length that is accurate, that is readable, that has a wide appeal, that's a very special skill to achieve that. And that skill comes from both any innate talent you have and generally an enormous amount of experience. So that's why we need ghostwriters, because frankly, if we left it to politicians and celebrities and almost anyone else to write their stories, very few people would publish it, and even fewer would likely to read it.
Yes, that's so true and so fantastic. And of course, and you mentioned this, you talked about working with your agent to, land some of these deals. We did have a couple of questions submitted about literary agents because they are, I think, for ghostwriting especially, they are, really pivotal in sourcing out those opportunities and really kind of getting those opportunities in front of you. So can you talk a little bit about how you get a literary agent and, what is your day-to-day interaction with them? And I would also be interested in knowing, because you write your own work as well, in addition to ghostwriting, is the interplay with those different? Does your literary agent weigh in more with the stuff that you do for yourself? Do they weigh in the same with the ghostwriting? How does it differ?
Good question. Obviously, an agent at a certain level of any writing profession is necessary. In ghostwriting, there's a special side to their role, which is to protect you as a writer. You are acting on behalf of someone else who generally has a very high public profile. If they're politicians, if they're business people, if they're celebrities of any kind, they are subject to legal concerns. Everyone would like to be able, I shouldn't say that, but it's very common for someone to say, this individual has offended me, said something untrue, I may explore legal action. So for example, an agent among all of his or her, and most good agents in my experience are women, a good agent makes certain that the contract you have with the subject and or with the subject's publisher contains legal protection to you. It's not your story you're telling, it's someone else's. And if they give you bad information, the onus has to be on them and not as you, as a poor struggling writer. As far as the work comes in, the work becomes almost always through my agent. She has a contact with the publishers. Sometimes the story idea begins with the publisher, as in the case with Justin Trudeau, as in the case with Robert Herjavec and many others. Sometimes it begins with the subjects themselves. They will contact me directly and I say, that sounds interesting, talk to my agent. I don't want to deal with money. I don't want to deal in terms of negotiations. I don't want to deal with legal concerns, but there are some elements that have to be nailed down. And the good agents are extremely valuable at that point. In terms of day-to-day contact with my agents, I may only talk to my agent 2 or 3 times a year. And that's regarding either ongoing or coming up or potential projects. But she is as close to me in many ways as my own daughter. So I'll leave it at that.
And how do you find a literary agent if you're
and I see now this is the ultimate writer's conundrum.
Yes.
The difficulty being is you can't get published generally, or it's very difficult to get published without an agent. And the other side of that coin is that agents don't like to take on unpublished authors. Now, obviously there are exceptions to that. The best thing to do is to well, one thing you can do, and one thing I did when I wanted an agent, was to contact writer friends of mine and say, who's your agent? And can you introduce me to her? I think they were always women. And submit some material or ideas. And good agents will have have the wherewithal, the imagination, the support, and so on to take you on and represent you, and you're halfway there at that point. And getting agents, I mean, all writers trade stories about agents, some of them less positive than others. My friend Ian Hamilton, who's succeeded with a great series of mysteries, I think he's published about 14 or 15 of them at this stage, had an idea for a series, and he actually drafted a manuscript on it, and he called the agency that represents me directly, and he spoke to the agent there, and he said, I have a book idea I'd like to send you. They just said, yeah. So tell me about the book. And he said, well, it is about an Asian lesbian forensic accountant living in Toronto who travels the world getting millions of dollars back from fraudsters with the help of her uncle, who was in the Chinese triune or criminal elements, to which the agent said, send it to me, I want to see it. And he was in. All he needed was one good idea, and he had this particular idea. Interestingly enough, when Ian mentioned it to his wife, she said, oh yeah, right, go ahead and write what you know. But he did it very successfully. But I don't want to play down in any way the importance of an agent. They are essential. And I think anything you can use to draw attention to an agent, convince an agent you can succeed, is worthwhile.
Mm-mm. Another question here. How do you balance your creative energy for your own writing with writing for others?
Well, we do everything we do in life is for fun and profit. And I don't make this conscious distinction, but it makes it easy to explain. I ghostwrite for profit, a good deal of fun in it. I meet a lot of interesting people, have a lot of wonderful times. And I write mystery novels for the fun of it. The profit is not that big at this stage in my writing career on mysteries, but it was great fun to determine where to find a body and whose body to find there and so on. All the usual things you hear about mystery writers. So when I'm not ghostwriting in between projects, I come up with some ideas and mysteries and go to work at them. It's a matter of enjoying writing so much and having the need to write regularly that really keeps me going in this area. It's just something I love to do.
That's lovely. This question kind of is related to that one a little bit, from Isabella in the audience, who asks, how do you cope with writing and creating fatigue and still ensure that you're meeting deadlines and remembering the reader when you're hearing the voice of the person who you're ghostwriting for?
Yeah, writing fatigue. I don't want to suggest it's that mechanical, but you are, as I say, as a ghostwriter, you are a professional and you act like it. And, I come in here in my office when I've got a project on every morning at 8 or 8:30, put my bottom in the seat, and I'm there until I hit my my quota for the day. And I try to do 1,000 to 1,500 words a day and leave time for rewriting them the following day. I mean, it's almost like a musician. If you want to become, and music was my second choice of a career, which didn't work out as well as writing. But if you want to be a musician, you better prepare yourself to practice over and over again. You better prepare yourself to listen carefully, to work on technique, to do it not because you have to, but because you love it. If you don't like writing, then forget about it. And I don't mean to be that dictatorial, but that's what it's about. Most writers absolutely love what they do. My good friend who just died recently, Peter Robinson, one of the best mystery writers in the business, said there are times when he can hardly wait. He gets up in the morning and he wants to rush through everything so he can get down at the desk and start writing. And most professional writers, almost all of them, will admit that this is true. And if they don't like it, don't do it.
And of course, one of the flip sides of, liking it is also learning to like and work through the less enjoyable parts of writing. And one of those less enjoyable parts of writing is the dreaded writer's block. So how do you work through writer's block in both of those instances, when you're writing your own work and then when you're working on a ghostwriting project? Do you get writer's block in those instances as well? And how do you work through it?
Well, again, separating them, I never get writer's block when I'm ghostwriting because the story is there. Now, I may run up against something where, boy, I better go back and ask him about this because I need more information. But the story is there. It's a matter of assembling it and in a manner that that matches the project you got. Let me rephrase that a little better. When I'm fiction writing, yes, I do get what's generally called writer's block. I've got one now in a mystery novel I started a few months ago, but I've got some other things to divert me. But the problem generally is something about characters or about plotting and so on in terms of the fiction writing I may be doing, and only I can solve them. In a ghostwriting situation, the character is there, the story is there, hidden somewhere. All you have to do is dig a little bit to find it and keep the narration moving forward. Just going back to fiction again, most writers I know, fiction writers who deal with this, trade ideas on how to overcome writer's block. One of them, which works for me, is that I begin talking to myself through my computer, and I'll literally write and say, okay, you got the problem here where this guy can't do that. But, and as strange as it seems, somewhere down the line, as I'm writing this, the solution begins to evolve. It seems like such a simple trick, but it's something that gets you out of your head into the book, and that's where you belong.
That's great. Hold on to that advice, audience. Use it for yourselves. Another question here from Kyle, who asks, John, when you are collecting story elements from a subject, is there a certain amount of key stories you're looking for to be able to fill a book? Or does the arc for the book itself decide if there's enough content? You know, is there a point at which you sort of understand, okay, I have enough to fill the book now?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I have to be careful the way I put this, because every ghostwriter, I think, will share the point of view. Not that we ghostwriters ever get together. There's no such thing as a ghostwriter society. And if there was, we wouldn't join it anyway. But without giving away any secrets too far, in some of my books, there is more of John Lawrence Reynolds in the book than there is of the subject. And this is not in terms of historical facts, which you can't do, but in terms of suggestions on how to be a salesperson, how to deal with some problems of personality conflicts and so on. And if I can't get it from the subject, but I realize it's very important to the thread of the narrative, I'll put in either my own experience or research the experience and frame it in the subject's voice. And quite honestly, readers might be very surprised, especially when it comes down to celebrity biographies, where you want the reader to say, oh my goodness, what an exciting adventure he or she has. And maybe it hasn't been that exciting. There is sometimes more fiction and nonfiction books than you might imagine, simply because the narration has to keep moving forward. I can think of 3 or 4 subjects where I had to say, what if we talk about this? And we put it this way. And they said, yeah, well, let's do it. It makes the book work. One brief example, if I may, by the way, I worked with Brian Tobin, who was a former Premier of Ontario and, I'm sorry, Premier of Newfoundland. Shoot me for that. And Minister of Fisheries. And was when John Chrétien was about to step down, his book, which was called All in Good Time, was designed to raise Brian's profile and abilities as a potential Liberal leader. And so we're always looking for things he could talk about that qualified him to be, well, frankly, Prime Minister. And as we were winding the book down, I had most everything. I said, Brian, we got nothing in here about healthcare, which is an absolute major subject in terms of federal politics. What are we going to do about it? And he said, in his lovely Newfoundland accent, which I won't try to reproduce, he said, well, boy, he said, when I was Premier, the health folks just hated me, and I really don't have any connection with them. We got to come up with something. So I said, well, what if we talked about this? And I ran through a number of items which I'd known about just from some research I had done. And he said, that sounds good. Put that together. So I did a chapter of about 2,000 words, showed it to him. He loved it. And he said, well, we put that in the book. It sounds wonderful. And I said, Brian, if you're ever elected prime minister, you better make me deputy minister of health because I just wrote your platform for you, which is true. Well, he didn't get that far, obviously, in things that we still will joke about it. Not that I see him as often as I'd like to, but that's the kind of thing as a ghostwriter you've got to do. Yes, you have to find ways to fill in the crevices of the narrative when they appear. And that's part of your chore.
And that is where the skill as a writer comes in, right? Like that's
yeah. And the thing is, I come back to keeping the faith. You have to do it in a manner that you're not cheating the reader. That is, everything you put in has to be something, if not directly from the subject's mouth. The subject says, yes, that's exactly the way I feel about it. And this is, again, part of playing both good friend and maybe, some family psychiatrist, because again, you're not a stenographer. You're not writing a diary. You're getting in your subject's head. And you have to listen very carefully. This is what I come back to recording what you have and to having the conversation and building trust with the subject. You have to listen carefully and realize he or she has just touched on something there, and that could be very important. And your most important response to a subject at that point is, tell me more about it, which sounds like a psychiatrist, frankly. Tell me about your mother. But those are the things you do, and quite often the gates open up and all kinds of wonderful stories, illuminating stories, not gossip. Stories that illuminate who this person is and what he or she is all about, and that makes the book come alive, because it comes from the heart of the subject.
Thank you for that. That is so much of what you were saying just rings so true on so many levels. And I'm so grateful for the wisdom that you're sharing with everyone today. A lot of questions coming in the Q&A box, and I'm going to try and move these two questions into one. And the first part of the question is, I have a manuscript that's almost completed. Can I still use a ghostwriter to finish it? So that's the first part.
That's interesting. I assume I don't know whether it's fiction or nonfiction. You can hire a writer to work on it. I've done a couple of assignments where I've been brought in to essentially quietly behind the scenes complete an incomplete or a seriously flawed manuscript. That's also obviously an editor's approach as well. However, in recent times, especially to me, I've been doing this for about 30, 40 years or so, we found the role of editors at publishing houses to be less and less. There was a time when you could take a half-finished manuscript to an editor and say, there's something happening here, try this, this, and this, and send them off to finish it. Doesn't happen today. If your manuscript isn't essentially publishing worthy, to coin a phrase, they'll simply send you back and say, you need a lot of work on this, and we'll see you later. So yes, you could hire someone. How you locate that someone is, of course, is a question I have no response for, unless you can make a contact with an agent who would represent someone to do this, with a fair warning being that it ain't cheap. Okay, that is, if you're really sold on this idea and you want someone to take a professional approach to it, well, someone may do it just out of the love of helping a struggling writer, but don't count on it. So I think it's quite reasonable to assume that this individual would take, let's call it, an extended editor's point of view, someone who takes the view that there's something here to be worked with, and instead of saying try this and try that, I'll fill in these couple of chapters here to keep the narrative rolling along. That may in fact happen. I think it's relatively rare, but it could happen.
Thank you. And you actually answered the second part of the question, which was asking about essentially how one finds ghostwriters. And I think you mentioned that through, mainly now they're found through literary agents who sort of scout opportunities.
Yes,
and that sort of
I've done a couple of books for wealthy American, as it turns out, they were developers, people in the US, nice guys. I like them both very much, one in Florida, one in California. Went down, spent a few days with them. They wanted their stories told, not necessarily for publishing purposes, although one of them succeeded at that, but simply because they wanted their families, their children, grandchildren, whoever, and their acquaintances they have, to understand where they came from and how they got to where they are. In some cases, these fellows were so wealthy that when the dividend check came in, they decided, well, let's see, do I buy a couple of more Porsches? Do I hire some guy to write my story for me? Well, I'll try that second choice for a change. Not quite that blatant, but it's happened, and I've done a couple of situations like that.
Mm. This question is a bit different. Goes back to something that you mentioned in your presentation, where you're saying, what happens when you have creative differences with your ghostwriting subject? How do you negotiate that?
Well, if there's strictly creative differences, frankly, you capitulate, because there is a bit of a parallel between being a ghostwriter, I don't want to take this too far, and being an attorney. That is, if you go to a lawyer and the lawyer says, I advise you to do this, you say, no, I want to do it this way, then the attorney will either say, you're a darn fool, and walk away, or say, well, let me help you position that so you can make the best of what you want to do. As a writer, as I said, if there was been any suggestion of using falses in a story to make it look better, it's been an absolute no. I'm not going to do that. I can't do that. As a matter of fact, it's in the contract that I don't have to do that. My sense is that it's not that common, because I think writers can size up the subjects fairly quickly at the beginning. If the chemistry isn't right, and I've done this in a number of times, you simply walk away from it. And that's sometimes difficult, especially if the fee being mentioned is pretty wealthy or pretty high. But as I say, you're going to spend 6 months to a year with this individual, and you'd better make certain to get along with them very well. I've got along with all the subjects extremely well, with one blatant exception that I won't mention, and I still stay in touch with them, time to time. Get a note from Herjavec or from Tobin and so on now and then, and that's good, because these people are fascinating to me as a writer, and it's good to hear from them now and then.
Mm. Another question from Isabella, who asks, how do you stop, even if you're fatigued with a manuscript, but interested in it and obsessing over it? How do you stop? How do you know when a book is complete, when a piece is complete, and you've taken it as far as it can go?
Well, that's the arc of the story. I think after 2 or 3 sessions, in my case, I have an idea of how the arc of the story will follow, where I'm going to get the reader into the story, how I'm going to progress through it. And I'm always a sucker for pretty crisp, endings with little hanger on, if you're going to call that commentaries or philosophies. As a storyteller, I think that's innate. I think you know how to tell the story, you know how to construct that and how to create the arc of it. And as I say, sometimes if you need something to complete the crevices on that arc, you go back to the subject and say, tell me more about this. Or what if we talk about this particular incident, and see if that fills it in. It's part of the storytelling craft.
That's great. A message from, or a question rather, from Christina, who asks, have you ever, oh, this is interesting. Have you ever had negative responses when you told someone that you were a ghostwriter, and how do you present it to people? And they note this has been a struggle for them when talking about their own work.
Well, some people collectively refer to ghostwriters as hacks, which I resent, but I don't. I'm not going to argue with it. We're doing this as a profession, but I think, and like any craft, there is a good way and a less than good way to do it. And I think if you're practicing your craft as successfully as possible, you should not have to apologize for it, and you should not have to accept any offhand criticism about the way you make your living any more than a musician or an artist does. It's what you choose to do, and you do it honestly, and you do it to the extent of your ability. You shouldn't have to apologize for anything.
That is wonderful. That is, really wonderful. Thank you for that, John. So we have one more question and it gets back to a little bit of the nitty gritty, ending on oh, I guess a little bit of a money question again, which can be a really great thing. How does accreditation work in terms of how you are accredited as a ghostwriter? How are you recognized for it? And then how are you get paid? Do you get paid in royalties, or do you get a flat contract and sort of that's it? Can you tell us a little bit about that portion of things?
Yes, of course. The first part, in terms of credits, this is all negotiated by your agent in the contract. There are various ways to get credit. Obviously, the best way is to have your name on the front cover, along with the subject's name, which doesn't happen that frequently. However, you can insist without too much resistance to have your name as a ghostwriter on the title page inside the book. And it usually says with John Lawrence Reynolds or whatever. Even at that, there can be some pushback, but almost every book published today, a nonfiction book, has acknowledgements in which the subject acknowledges his or her family, editor, publisher, and so on. And it's not difficult to have your name inserted in there. For example, in the Justin Trudeau book, I knew I wouldn't get cover credit. It was going to be difficult to get any credit inside, but it was relatively easy to get my name inserted among the editors and copywriters or copy readers and everything else. And that's all we needed, somebody to say this worked. So that's that. In terms of payment, in almost every case at this stage in my life anyway, it's a fee up front, and I bypass the royalties. Not all the time. I did a book for a fascinating gentleman called Frank O'Day, who's a co-founder of Second Cup. Frank O'Day was an alcoholic and went through a terrible periods of abuse in his teenage years and early 20s. And when he was in his early 20s, he found himself just before Christmas standing on a street in Toronto begging for enough money for a bottle of wine, at which point he said, I'm going to die if I don't change. He changed that day, and 10 years later, he sold his share in Second Cup, which he had launched with his partner, for a few $1 million, and has gone on now to enormous success as a business person. We did a book called When All You Have Is Hope, and he was so pleased with that, he insisted on dividing the royalties with me. The book is still selling. I think it was published 10, 15 years ago. And so twice a year, I get a little bit of a check, and big enough one for take my wife out for dinner or something like that. Otherwise, it's a straight fee up front to get the job done, with an option that if a second book by that subject comes along, I'm the first one to get a chance to do it. Other than that, it's, as I say, it's a very mercenary arrangement, like it or not.
Hey, it's you got to put food on the table somehow.
Yes, yes.
We do have one more surprise question, which
Sure.
popped in the chat, so it relates to this actually. Jeff says, without an agent to negotiate on your behalf, how do you price out or quote a book length project of 6 months of work or more? Do you specify each component, like amount of interviews equals X amount of money, drafting time, revision process? Can you speak to that?
No, it's well, first of all, I won't negotiate. I sat in once on a negotiating session with my agent. It was so embarrassing. I said I'll never do it again. Just get back to that. There is a fee to complete the job. The fee is negotiated. My agent and I have a bottom, a ground price, if you will, that we won't go below. It's going to be this much or more. And the fee structure can be negotiated as well. There's usually some money up front as soon as we sign the contract. And it's often into equal thirds, 1/3 on signing contract, 1/3 on delivery of the finished manuscript, 1/3 on publication. In some situations, as the recent one, it's half on signing, half on delivering an approved manuscript. And thank you very much, goodbye. So if that answers it, I cannot underestimate or undervalue a good agent, because writers have certain talents, and God bless them. Those of us who manage to make use of them do our best to polish them and maintain them. And one of the talents we don't have, for most of the writers I've spoken to, is the chance to pound on the table and say, no, I want more money, or I want this particular accreditation. That's what agents do, and the good ones do it very well. And the good ones, by the way, are also very nice people generally. They simply have this particular knack that writers lack.
Yeah, I can absolutely echo that. A good agent is worth their weight in gold.
Yes, they are.
Time to wrap up now, and I will wrap up initially by reading a comment from Vance LeBlanc in the comments section, who I think speaks for all of us. He says, "This session has been very instructive, and it's a special honor to have been exposed to Mr. Reynolds. Thank you very much." So thank you so much, John, for all of the wisdom and the knowledge that you shared with us today. I want to thank you for all of your time. It was so fascinating to hear about these insider secrets and stories. For everyone who is joining, please remember to share your thoughts with us in the pop-up survey. The Alumni Engagement Office has a lot of events like this with other alumni from McMaster. Be sure to check out their website for a full listing at alumni.mcmaster.ca. Thank you everyone for attending. Have a great rest of your day.